Hello, I am Professor Kino, and welcome to my Office of Cinematic Antiquity. Today we'll be talking about... Personally, I didn't have much in the way of expectation going into Gemini Man. Unlike the group of people that had been following the elongated production of this film for the past 20-ish years, a delay caused by the technology not being ready for the film apparently, I wasn't really aware of its existence until its first trailer dropped a couple of months back. However, when I saw that it was directed by the talented Ang Lee, who has brought us wonderful films such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Life of Pi, Sense and Sensibility, and Brokeback Mountain, and starred the charismatic Will Smith in not one but two roles, I assumed that this film couldn't go wrong, and it promptly went onto my radar. But as the first reviews for it began being published in the week leading up to Gemini Man's release, the consensus was less than kind. But I was still moderately interested in it, and since nothing else was really playing in the cinematic doldrums where I live, I decided to give it a whirl. Premise: after the expert sniper assassin Henry Brogan decides that he wants to retire from his life of violence, he is dragged back into it after he learns some information that puts him on the hit list of the government agency he used to work for. But as if that wasn't enough, the assassin sent to kill Henry looks and acts eerily like a younger version of himself. Totally not a clone. Writing. Judging by the writing credits alone, it is clear that Gemini Man's screenplay has been tweaked and rewritten a lot over the past 20-ish years. And to be honest, it kinda shows because the result feels like it has been continuously course-corrected until the final draft resembled the most generic action film possible, one without a clear vision or a singular voice. Gemini Man does have some fun and unique ideas, but none of them are strong enough to really differentiate it from the plethora of other by-the-numbers action films out there. The writing tries to tackle PTSD, blind loyalty, and determine whether or not you can maintain a clear conscience in war under the pretext that you are just quote-unquote following orders. However, there is no depth to these concepts, and the film as a whole is content with keeping its ideas surface level. The deepest I think it gets is by 1, making Henry unable to look at himself in the mirror because of what he sees in his own eyes, i.e. soul. At least that's what we were told, we never actually see him shying away from his reflection. And 2, featuring a literal confrontation between Henry and himself, the alternate version of which is a conveniently younger one that can still be saved from all of the trauma and damage that Henry's line of work caused him. Yep, that's about as far as the film goes with its philosophical questions. And to make matters even more problematic, Gemini Man also never really comes into its stride tonally. With its conceptual ideas, you'd think that it would want to be serious, and it definitely is, but the film undermines itself by having most of its dialogue be cliché and cheesy. There was one line in particular that had me laughing out loud. During it, Henry is talking with this informant that he had been looking for some time, and during the conversation, Henry asks why they can't just launch a missile at the main villain's facility and destroy it, and I kid you not, the informant just says, "That's exactly what we're gonna do, and you are the missile." Like Christ, it's too ridiculous for its own good. And it's all presented to us in this self-serious shell that just does not mesh. Add in that the main twists aren't really surprising because they are more or less generic action movie twists, that there is a lack of in-depth characterization, one character even switches sides in a single scene without much explanation, and that the ending feels rushed and anticlimactic, and the result is writing/a narrative that undercuts the foundational messages that this film is trying to convey. However, I don't mean to sound super negative here, because there is some fun to be had. Despite being full of tropes, they are adhered to moderately well. There is a reason for the existence of tropes, i.e. they work when done properly, and I found myself engaged in the story enough, but by and large, the whole thing is a little disappointing, considering the amount of time that this screenplay has been in the incubator. I mean, you think that after 20 years, the meat of Gemini Man would have evolved beyond being a generic action romp with some basic surface-level insight into the head of an expert assassin who has grown weary of his line of work. Acting. The acting here is good, considering the material given to the talent on screen. Will Smith is his charismatic self once again, and just because it's him, Henry is a character that is easy to like. That being said, Smith doesn't show much range in the role, he is just Will Smith playing a Will Smith character. There isn't much that's new. Although Smith does play two characters here, and his performance as Junior, Henry's clone, is a bit outside of Smith's comfort zone. However, Junior is mostly just a whiny, immature character who has a tendency to melt down emotionally. Smith plays the role well, but it doesn't feel nearly as multifaceted as I'm sure Smith had hoped it would be, but that's mostly due to the mediocre writing of Junior, to be honest. Long story short, Smith is believable in both of his roles here, and he does his best to elevate both characters' dialogue, but there isn't a whole lot for him to work with. And that pretty much sums up the entire cast here, namely Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Clive Owen, and Benedict Wong. Good, but they can only take the material so far. Costumes, hair, and makeup. The costumes were very basic: jeans, hoodies, monocolored jackets, khakis, military garb, etc. But the film was going for a slightly more realistic aesthetic, so the costume choices actually worked well. However, a few times the film flips its baseline aesthetic on its head and introduces us to some wild-looking wacko, such as a guy in a super soldier suit near the end that felt strangely out of place compared to the rest of the cast's costumes. The designs of these outliers were never bad, but it felt odd when the average Joe-esque garb was suddenly confronted with some futuristic sci-fi razzmatazz. It doesn't happen often, but I thought it strange enough to acknowledge. Costumes aside, however, the makeup for the most part is quite fantastic. It was designed to mirror the realistic everyday feel of the costumes, and the result is something unusual for a Hollywood picture. To showcase what I mean with an example, the actors' hair after the action scenes stayed matted, frizzy, and dirty instead of going miraculously back to looking like the actors just got done doing a photo shoot. It's unusual, but quite a welcome change. Set design. There is a nice variety of locations that this film takes place in, from the small towns, fields, and waters of Georgia, to the colorful streets of Cartagena, to the wonderfully historic Budapest. Each locale felt very different aesthetically and architecturally, and each provided a unique backdrop for one of the film's action scenes, so as to keep them fresh and exciting. And each place had a lot of little details within them that kept them visually fun in their own right as well, such as with the inclusion of street art, catacombs, exotic animals, etc. I dug the sets a lot and thought that they were one of the best aspects of Gemini Man. Choreography. There are some great action scenes here, particularly a fantastic one that happens across the rooftops and streets of Cartagena that involved gunplay, beatdowns, and a motorcycle chase. But there are also a handful of action scenes that are merely fine. While each action sequence does have its great moments, sometimes they are just unexciting. Not in any bad way, just seen it before, and that can be a little disappointing for an action film. None of the choreography is ever bad, but being that Gemini Man is an action film, it would have been nice if every action scene was a standout instead of just a few, like the action scene in Cartagena. Cinematography. Judging by the way that this film was shot, it was designed to be shown at 120 frames per second and in 3D, as opposed to the normal 24 frames per second and 2D. Alas, I was not able to see Gemini Man in the way it was intended, because there was just no option to see it like that where I live. But I can see how seeing it at 120 FPS in 3D would be appealing. The whole film is shot very realistically, and it felt, like I heard one critic say, like a nature documentary. The camera work favored pans, dollies, and tracking more than cuts and jumps to make us, the audience, feel like we are actually in the film, and the result often looks very nice. In addition, there is some nice framing regarding the sets, the slower moments, and during some of the action. And I say some because, in an apparent attempt to make the action feel more realistic and tense, the camera had a tendency to pull in very tight, and the result could make the action scenes a little disorientating, slightly claustrophobic, and overall annoying to watch. Like, I knew that there was some cool action going on, but it was really hard to see it clearly. It didn't happen all the time, but it occurred enough for me to grow weary of it. Perhaps my opinion on this stylistic choice would change if I was able to see the film in its natural 120 FPS 3D format, but that is unfortunately not an option for me, which is a little unfortunate. But if you are going to offer showings of a film at 24 FPS in 2D, it would be nice if the action always looked great, in every available format. Editing. While the action could get a little choppy, most of the editing was good. There was one scene involving a phone call where the editing made it a little difficult to tell where each character was specifically, and throughout the film the main characters did have the ability to get thousands of miles away in the span of a single cut, but the movie, besides these small issues, was rather easy to follow, thanks in part due to the film's heavy use of long tracking shots that limited the number of edits needed. CGI. Gemini Man's ad campaign put its de-aging technology front and center. A huge part of the film involved bringing a young 20-something Will Smith to life using the real Will Smith and CGI. So a lot was riding on the CGI here, but unfortunately, I found it to be hit and miss. Some scenes were flawless, but others felt off, and I think a lot of that has to do with the uncanny valley, that uneasy feeling you get when you see something that is almost human looking, but not entirely. And I think the biggest culprit that caused this sensation here was that young CGI Will Smith shared most of his scenes with real Will Smith. So I often found myself seeing the slight irregularities in the CGI version more because the real version was right there for comparison. It's impressive that it worked as well as it did, and even more impressive that it was occasionally perfect, but some scenes, such as the final scene, made young CGI Will Smith noticeably CGI. He just felt off compared to the rest of the actors in the scene. Besides this new technology, however, the rest of Gemini Man's CGI was solid, except for the movements of a random super soldier near the end. It was nothing flashy, mostly just little things here and there. So in summation, the CGI here is impressive but not perfect, and that's a little rough considering how much was riding on it. Music. It's fine. Like most of Gemini Man's other pieces, its music is pretty generic. It's your typical action thriller stuff with a tiny dash of sci-fi sounds spliced in. But it didn't really resonate with, or I felt elevate the film. I mean, it worked well enough for what it was aiming for, but that's about it. Direction. Ang Lee is an undoubtedly talented director, and Gemini Man has aspects in it that support this claim. It has some great set pieces, some solid cinematography, a handful of great ideas at its core, and showcases some intriguing new technology. Unfortunately, however, none of its flashiness is able to elevate itself above its clear flaws, i.e. its generic plot, some unexciting action, which is a bit of a deal breaker for an action film, and the fact that its proclaimed groundbreaking CGI tech isn't 100% perfect. While Gemini Man has its moments, and because of them the experience is moderately entertaining, I'm starting to wonder if its 20-year production delay was only due to the quote-unquote technology not being ready, or if there was actually a little more at play than that. My enjoyment. I thought Gemini Man was alright. Nowhere near as terrible as critics have proclaimed it to be, but I definitely see where many of them are coming from. It has a lot of flaws. While I liked some parts, I have to admit that by the end I just didn't really care all that much. I mean, I'd watch it again if I stumbled upon it on TV, but it's not something I'm going to put on my must-see again list. And with the plethora of talent that this film features, both in front of and behind the camera, that's a little saddening. Recommendations. If you are looking for a passable action film to, well, pass the time and or are a fan of Will Smith, then Gemini Man is a solid enough choice. But you really need to know the flaws going in to really find enjoyment here, because while there is a great movie somewhere in this title, there is just too much that is by the numbers and bland to make it anything other than passable. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it. If you did, leave a like. If you want to add anything, feel free to leave a comment. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I am Professor Kino, and I look forward to our next discussion.